Hi, I'm Edward Funk, and this is podcast number 27. Now, you probably noticed in the last several podcasts, um, it's, it's been Hollywood themed, and I noticed a lot about Hollywood, and that's because I'm talking about a part of my life when I was actress Loretta Young's biographer. So, and I hope you find it as interesting uh, as I do. If you're curious about the golden age of Hollywood, well, hop on and come along for a ride. Now, in the last podcast, I mentioned that I was going to reveal some of Loretta's acting secrets. In real life, uh, she was a graceful beauty like Audrey Hepburn, both having the advantage of long necks. In The Farmer's Daughter, the film Loretta won a Best Actress Oscar for, she decided that the Minnesota farm girl that she was playing should look like, well, what Loretta thought a Minnesota farm girl should look like, which meant not that long neck. So what she did, she had her wardrobe built up so that her neck actually shrank, and you didn't see what you usually see in a Loretta movie with her long neck until the end of the film when the love story is culminating. Um, Now, she had a dispute with the director. She often had disputes with directors. Uh, this had to do with she'd worked very hard to learn a Swedish accent. She had a coach named Ruth Roberts who had actually coached Ingrid Bergman on how to lose her Swedish accent. And Loretta and Ingrid Bergman were friends, and they used to joke, after this, that Ruth had taken Ingrid's Swedish accent away and then given it to Loretta. So, anyway, they're about halfway through making this movie, and the director decides, I think you need to ease up on that accent. By this time in the film, the audience is probably getting tired of it. So, we really don't need it. And Loretta responded, um, yes. And the audience will ask, what's wrong with that actress? Half the time she speaks with the accent, and half the time she doesn't. So she basically insisted that she was going to keep the accent, and she did. Now, another dispute with the director, this is early in the story, where her character was supposed to walk across the lawn to get to the front door of this home. And Loretta said, well, I'm not going to do that because, this is a farm girl and she'd have so much respect for the land that she would never walk on the ground. And she got away with this one too, but I could have told her, I grew up on a farm. We walked over the lawn all over the time. But anyway, this is how big stars stay big stars because um, they get their way on the important things that makes a difference to them. Now, after she told me about the Sidewalk Lawn story, she said, now, but if I were trying to play a much more sophisticated character, and she referenced where she played the leading lady in the movie And Now Tomorrow. Actually, she was the central character. Loretta said, if I were out to get a man, I'd walk this way. And then she got up and she demonstrated that, she would walk her, let me see, movements would be much more undulating and she would, one leg slightly crossing the other and everything was so much slower. And later I noticed her walking this way in the last scene of And Now Tomorrow as she's approaching Ellen Ladd. Who she really couldn't stand in real life. We'll get to the reasons why of that in another podcast. Now, Loretta and I spent more and more time together, and I'd often drive in on a Saturday night to go to Mass at the Church of the Good Shepherd in Beverly Hills. Now, on one of these occasions, we had driven her Rolls Royce, a vintage 1964 model in brown and taupe colors. And it was the last of those silver clouds. She recently had it detailed, and it was absolutely beautiful. Returning home, the car broke down at Lexington Avenue and Benedict Canyon Road. Now, that was the corner where Charo lived. You probably remember her from, if you go back this far, from like being on the Johnny Carson show. And she was a Latin singer, but she'd always pretend like her English wasn't that good. And she would say something, oops, not quite appropriate. And the audience got a big howl out of it. Anyway, that's where the car broke down. Now, car phones were just emerging, and Loretta didn't have one yet. So as she stood by her Rolls, it was fascinating to watch people screeching their brakes, stopping, and competing as to who would be allowed to help. Now, had this been my old VW Rabbit, I would have been barraged with horns honking at me, telling me, get that car off the road. Now, Loretta had a station wagon, which was her primary mode of transportation. And when we scooted around town, I often drove it. We had a little game we would play when we were stopped at a light. Loretta would observe the occupants in the next car and deduce their life story. Now, on one afternoon, we're at the corner of Roxbury and Sunset in Beverly Hills. This was only about a block from where Lucille Ball had lived, but Lucille is no longer living, but just I wanted to throw that in there. So anyway, we're at that intersection, and her assessment was particularly prescient. The car to our right was a creamish yellow Mercedes coupe convertible with the top up, occupied by two women. It was the driver of whom Loretta offered an evaluation. What I remember was a woman in her 40s with a nicely featured face, but still rather hard, auburn hair, and wearing a sweater with a fur collar. Loretta assessed the value of the sweater, the coiffure, the jewelry, and of course the car, and came up with an instant biography. She said that this woman was recently divorced, but that her husband had been married before, and that this woman had been the cause of that breakup. Then the light changed, and the Mercedes sped out in front of us, and tellingly, the license plate read, "He pays." Now, I think Loretta was so good at this game because observing people in their context really had been her acting school over many years. Now, over time, I recognized Loretta's reaction to her fan mail can be quite different according to her mood. Once a week, the William Morris agency would bring over a huge envelope of letters. And when Loretta was well rested, she'd take the time to read it, and she'd appreciate the sentiment. Other times, when she was stressed out by other matters, those letters went straight into the trash. She'd lament, it's over 30 years since the TV show ended. Will this ever end? Now, it scared her when fans showed up at the door. This happened a few times while I was there, and she'd send me out to get rid of them. And these people could be pretty crazy, but I was always successful in getting rid of them. A similar thing happened to her sister, Polly Ann. Someone had stopped at her home to have an autograph, have her autograph, a publicity picture from the early 30s. I was there a few days later, and Polly Ann said, "Why would someone be interested in some cowboy picture I made 60 years ago? It just doesn't make any sense." Now, I was beginning to know Polly Ann well enough. And I was able to see this through her eyes. She had made those films solely to earn money, totally detached from the sacredness our cultures assign towards the movie screen and the people who appear in them. Now, Loretta much better understood the fan adoration. In fact, she had cultivated it. But now she was using that same kind of focus to apply to the book we were writing. My method of working with Loretta was to sit at a round table in the living room and take the interviews. If Loretta wanted to discuss something personal, not for public consumption, she'd say, "Turn that thing off," pointing to the tape recorder. Or she'd say, "Turn that damn thing off." Um, One night, well, I had a friend, Larry Wilson, who was a medical transcriber, and he transcribed these tapes. And one night I was having dinner at Loretta's house, and Pollyann was there too. And Loretta came up with this idea, well, why not just keep the tape recorder running? Who knows? Maybe we'll say something interesting. And Pollyann chimed in. It's just Gretch, because she called her Gretch. Her given name was Gretchen. And her family, her nickname was Gretch. But she said, "Gretch, uh, you know, that's insane. What we say isn't that interesting. And transcribing these tapes takes time and money." I was so grateful to Pollyann that night because she was right. And Loretta's had an interesting reaction. She just kind of humbly said, "Well, I guess you're right." And I realized that when Pollyann, the oldest sister, did offer some kind of mild chastisement, Loretta fell directly in line. And several weeks later, Pollyann told me that um, she knew how to give Loretta just a certain look. Um, it was really the same look that her mother had given the kids when she was trying to bring them into line. But it was still working with Pollyann to Loretta. Okay, we're moving on to, well, one last thing about Pollyann. She was about 80, maybe she was 80. She was still an attractive woman, but she looked 80. And her voice was very deep due to decades of heavy smoking. And Josie Wayne, John Wayne's first wife, was the same age as Pollyann, and they became friends as adolescents. And that's how Josie was entered into the household, Pollyann and her sisters, including Loretta. And then when Loretta was an adult, Josie was also an adult, their friendship became more solidified because they were both more into that same Hollywood world. They traveled in the same circles. Now, Josie came to Loretta one day to allow me to interview her. She was blonde, she was vivacious, and a flirt. In fact, she was telling me a story about some woman, and she was trying to make a point about her. And she said, she's the kind of woman who lost interest in men a long time ago. Then she looked at Loretta and she said, "You know what I mean?" And Loretta nodded her head in affirmation. And I thought to myself, what an interesting observation, because I'm with two women right now who have never lost their interest in men. They were still playful, still coquettish. Now, during the conversation that afternoon, Loretta brought up the point that they'd been best friends all these years, but still maintained certain boundaries. For instance, she said, when Josie and Duke were still married, and he was having an affair with Marlene Dietrich, I didn't go and blab about that to Josie. An uncomfortable look crossed Josie's face, even though the John Wayne Marlene Dietrich playing was 50 years in the past. Now, Irene Dunn was one of Loretta's closest movie star friends. We'll talk about her in the next podcast, as well as my meeting, starting a long line of meeting movie stars of Loretta's era. So I hope you'll be interested, and I hope we'll see you then. Thank you so much. Ciao.